The Bible is not a single book. It is a library of 66 books. But here is the question nobody asks. Who decided which books made the cut and which ones got thrown in the trash?
If you open a Catholic Bible, it has 7 extra books in the Old Testament. If you open an Ethiopian Orthodox Bible, it has even more, including the ancient Book of Enoch. But if you open a Protestant Bible, you only get 66. So who is right? You have probably heard the rumors. Some say a shady council of bishops in the 4th century just voted on the books to control the masses. Others say thousands of lost gospels were deliberately burned by the early church to hide the truth.
But what if I told you that the church didn't create the Bible? What if I told you they merely discovered it? Today, we are decoding the history of the Biblical Canon. We are going to look at why Catholics have extra books, what happened to the lost Gospels, and why the Ethiopian Church has a different list. Welcome to Doctrine Distilled. Let's distill the truth. Before we look at the history, we have to understand what the word canon actually means. It comes from a Greek word meaning measuring rod or standard. But here is the most important concept you need to understand today: the difference between inspired and recognized. Imagine a museum curator looking at a painting by Vincent van Gogh. The curator doesn't make the painting valuable. The painting is already valuable because of the artist who created it. The curator simply recognizes its value and places it in the gallery. The early church did not make the books of the Bible authoritative. The books were already authoritative because of the God who inspired them. The church simply recognized them and placed them in the gallery of Scripture. But how did they know which ones belonged in the gallery? That brings us to the Old Testament. For the Old Testament, the early Christians didn't have to guess. They looked to the Jewish people who had been preserving these texts for centuries. The Jewish canon, known as the Tanakh, was closed and universally recognized by the 1st century AD. It contained the law, the prophets, and the writings. But here is where the Catholic Deuterocanon comes in. Before Christ, a Greek translation of the Old Testament was made, called the Septuagint. This translation included a few extra Jewish historical books, like Maccabees and Tobit. When the early church started using the Septuagint, they read these extra books. But the early church fathers knew the difference. Jerome, the scholar who translated the Latin Vulgate, explicitly said these extra books were good for reading, but should not be used to establish doctrine. Fast forward to the Protestant Reformation. Martin Luther and the Reformers looked at the original Hebrew manuscripts and said, if it wasn't in the original Hebrew Jewish canon, it doesn't belong in the Old Testament. So they moved those books to a separate section called the Apocrypha, and eventually they were removed entirely from Protestant Bibles.
The Catholic Church later made those books official at the Council of Trent in 1546. So the difference isn't about a secret conspiracy. It's about whether you follow the original Hebrew canon or the later Greek translation. But what about the New Testament? This is where the biggest myth comes in. You have probably heard that the Roman Emperor Constantine compiled the New Testament at the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD to consolidate his power. This is historically false. The Council of Nicaea was called to discuss the deity of Christ, not to vote on the books of the Bible. The Council's actual records don't even mention the canon. So how did the New Testament actually form? It wasn't a top-down vote. It was a bottom-up consensus. The early churches were already reading the Gospels and Paul's letters in their weekly gatherings. By the year 200 AD, the core 4 Gospels and the letters of Paul were universally accepted across the Roman Empire. They used 3 simple tests to recognize a book. Was it written by an apostle or a close associate of an apostle? Did it align with the established orthodox teaching of the church? Was it widely used by churches across different regions?
But what about the lost Gospels, like the Gospel of Thomas or the Gospel of Judas? Why were they left out?
Because they failed the test. The Gospel of Thomas wasn't written until the mid-2nd century, over 100 years after Jesus. It wasn't written by Thomas, and its content was bizarre. It contained sayings like, Jesus said, "Make Mary male. For every woman who makes herself male will enter the kingdom of heaven." The early church didn't burn these books to hide the truth. They rejected them because they were late, fraudulent, and completely disconnected from the eyewitness testimony of the 1st century.
But wait, we have not looked at the hardest part yet. What about the Ethiopian Orthodox Church? Their Bible has 81 books, including 1 Enoch and Jubilees. If the canon is so clear, how do we explain them? Here is the historical truth. Ethiopia is one of the oldest Christian nations in the world, converting in the 4th century. But because of its geographic isolation, it was largely cut off from the rest of the Christian world for centuries.
While the rest of the church was narrowing down the canon to the 66 books we use today, the Ethiopian church preserved a much broader, older tradition of Jewish and early Christian texts. They highly revered the Book of Enoch because it was quoted in the New Testament book of Jude. Does this mean the Protestant canon is wrong? No. It means the Ethiopian canon is a fascinating, beautiful historical anomaly. It reflects a localized, ancient tradition, rather than the universal, apostolic consensus of the early church. Now, I want to be completely honest with you. The process of finalizing the list wasn't instant. It took centuries for the church to formally close the canon. The first time we see the exact 27 books of the New Testament listed together is in a letter by Athanasius in 367 AD. It was a messy, gradual process of the church realizing what it already possessed. But the authority of those books was recognized by the believers long before a bishop ever put his stamp on a list. So why does this matter? Why spend time arguing over ancient book lists? Because this question determines who has the ultimate authority. If the church created the canon through a vote, then the church is above the Bible. The church can change it, add to it, or subtract from it. But if the church merely recognized the canon, then the Bible is above the church. The church is subject to the text, not the other way around. Understanding the canon protects you from conspiracy theories, and it anchors your faith in the historical, eyewitness reality of the 1st century, rather than the traditions of men. We have seen that the text is preserved, logically consistent, divinely inspired, accurately translated, and faithfully compiled. The church didn't create the Bible. They just recognized the measuring rod that God had already provided. But this leaves us with one final, massive question. Now that we know which books belong in the Bible, how do we actually interpret the most complex, fear-mongering, and misunderstood prophecy in the entire library? If this helped you see the Bible's history clearly, hit subscribe so you don't miss the breakthrough.